Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I am Sayyid Akif Shah, lecturer finance at Institute of Business Studies, Kohat University of Science and Technology. The title of this course is Business Research Methods, and the course code for this subject is MS 312. This is lecture number 20th, and the topic for today's discussion is the research process. Since this topic occupies number of steps and it involves 8 to 9 steps to cover the complete scientific research process. So therefore, in particular in this lecture, the emphasis will be on the step number 6, which is hypothesis development. Dear students, this is a complete research diagram, and on the same topic, which is the research process, I have a couple of my previous lectures which explained the broad problem area, preliminary data gathering, then narrow down and clearly define the research problem. Similarly, we have discussed the critical literature review, and as well as in my previous couple of lectures, I have discussed in detail regarding the theoretical framework, which is the identification of the important variable which are pertinent to the research problem, like dependent variable and independent variable, along with the moderating and mediating variables were discussed in detail. Therefore, we are on step number 6, and in particular to this lecture, the emphasis will be on the formulation or the generations of the hypothesis of our research study. Dear students, on the basis of critical literature review, where we have highlighted the important variables related and appropriate to our research study, and then we have formulated a good theoretical framework which furnishes the grounds for hypothesis development. So the outline of this lecture will comprises of a short definition of the theoretical framework, which will furnish or set the grounds for the discussion of types of hypothesis, and later on how to make or develop the research hypothesis. What is a theoretical framework? As earlierly explained in my previous lecture, it is a logically developed, described and elaborated network of association among the variables which are deemed relevant to the problem situation, and these have been highlighted with the help of taking interviews, observations, and as well as the literature review, which is very much important. It actually highlights the published and unpublished material, which assists the researcher to identify and label the important variable as dependent variable, independent variables, and if there is importance of the moderating and mediating or intervening variables. So we can conclude that literature review provides solid foundation for the development of theoretical framework, which will further furnishes grounds for the development of hypothesis. So the prime focus of this lecture is on the hypothesis development. So let us define what is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable statement that describes the relationship between two or more variables. Like in our previous step, which was theoretical framework development, where we have narrated the relationship between dependent and independent variables. This hypothesis it is a statement which is in the testable form, and it could be tested after collection of data, where we analyze our data with the help of statistical packages. By applying certain methodology, we actually test the hypothesized statement which was developed on the basis of good theoretical framework. Therefore, it is a prediction of consequences. A hypothesis statement, since it is testable, is considered valuable even if it is proven false. Like we have hypothesized regarding certain phenomena, and if it has been proved false, still it is important because it will lead towards the acceptance of alternative hypothesis, which will be discussed shortly in this lecture. Hypotheses should be testable statements. For example, in the previous lecture, we have discussed the conceptual model of the air traffic crash or collisions and highlighted certain number of variables as independent variables. So how could we develop or formulate hypotheses on the basis of that theoretical framework? As an example, we can hypothesize that if the pilots are given adequate training to handle the mid-air crowded situations, the air safety violation will be reduced. Now, this statement can be testable because we can collect data on the adequate training, and then we can measure the number of air safety violation by the cockpit crew or the pilots. If a particular statement has been formulated in this fashion, where we can find out the nexus between the dependent and independent variable and which can be measurable, it is actually known as a hypothesized statement. So what is a statement of hypothesis and its format? There could be an if and then statement format. Like we can transform the employees. It is a hypothesis which is in a proposition form. Employees who are more healthy will take sick leaves less frequently. So we can say that this statement is going to test that when the employees of the organization stay healthy, they will ask for sick leave less frequently. How can we transform this statement into an if and then statement in this fashion? Like, if the employees are more healthy, then they will take sick leaves less frequently. So it is one of the format with the help of which we can formulate our research hypothesis. And since this is in a testable form, we can test that when the employee's record is quite healthier, usually they do not take any sick leave. The second type of hypothesis can be the directional hypothesis. For example, if the terms such as positive, negative, more than, less than, etc. are used, then these are known as directional hypothesis. As an example, we can discuss the statement as a directional hypothesis as: the greater the stress experienced in the job, the lower the job satisfaction of the employees. Now we can see that the word greater is giving us a direction that when there is a high level of stress experienced by the employee on the job while working in a particular organization, they will have lower level of job satisfaction. So we can imagine and we can judge a positive direction between the dependent and independent variable of our interest. Now this statement is in a testable form statement, therefore we can say it is a directional hypothesis. Let's take another example. For example, satisfied workers are more motivated than the dissatisfied workers. Similarly, once again, a direction has been cleared that when the employees or worker of the organizations are more satisfied, more motivated, the employees of the organization are more satisfied from their working environment or job, it will lead towards the more motivation level than the dissatisfied people. Satisfied workers are usually more motivated towards work than the dissatisfied worker, and this statement has been hypothesized, which can later be tested in the statistical analysis step. Third format can be a non-directional hypothesis where there is no direction. Like, non-directional hypothesis postulate a relationship between two variables but do not offer any indication of the direction, like either the variable is impacting in a positive fashion or in the negative manner. For example, there is a relationship between age and job satisfaction. A researcher is interested to find out the nexus or relationship between the age and job satisfaction, and there is no positive or a negative direction highlighted in this hypothesis. We cannot infer at this stage that if the worker's age is higher, then he will be more satisfied on the job, or if the age of the worker is lower, then he will be more satisfied on the job. We cannot infer the particular direction in this hypothesis. Therefore, we can say that this is a non-directional hypothesis. As another example, there is difference between work ethics values of American and Asian employees. Now, once again, we can test this statement that either there is a difference between the work ethics values of American and Asian employees, but we cannot infer the direction of the relationship between American and Asian or the work ethic and Asian or American workers. Another one is known as, in order to conclude the non-directional hypothesis, we can say that non-directional hypotheses are used either because the relationship have never been explored before and hence there is no basis for the indication of the direction. After thorough study and writing down the critical literature review, but still the researcher is unable to highlight a proper direction in the literature. Therefore, such kind of hypothesis has been formulated by the researcher. Or we can say that because there have been a conflicting finding in the previous researches about the variable of our interest, therefore we cannot confidently formulate positive or negative directional hypothesis. So as a conclusion, we can say that the non-directional hypotheses are formulated by the researcher when there is conflicting finding in the literature review regarding those variables, or there is no basis for indication of direction in the literature. Now, after discussing the null hypothesis, which is a testable statement, what is an alternative hypothesis? Basically, there are two hypotheses. One is known as null, another one is known as alternate hypothesis. The researcher's prime focus is to reject the null hypothesis or that testable statement. And ultimately, the researcher's motto is to go with the alternative hypothesis to conclude the finding that alternate does exist. So basically, the alternative hypothesis is the opposite of the null hypothesis. It can only be reached if the null hypothesis is rejected, which will be discussed shortly with the help of an example. Similarly, the alternate hypothesis is actually the desired conclusion of the research, as I have already explained. Let us take an example that a researcher has hypothesized a testable statement after writing down the theoretical framework as advertisement have no effect on sales. Now, advertising is actually your independent variable and sale is your dependent variable. And this has been formalized as a testable statement of null hypothesis. And researchers interested to reject this null hypothesis. The reason is he is interested to infer or confirm the alternative hypothesis, which explain that this is when alternative hypothesis usually depicted or labeled as H1, and one should be in the subscript, and null hypothesis has been labeled, or usually the norm says to label it with H and subscript naught, H naught. The H1 says, which is an alternative hypothesis, that advertising have effect on sales. So when this null hypothesis will be rejected on the basis of data the researcher has accumulated, and later on in the data analysis and statistical test application, the results, if the results reject the null hypothesis on the basis of confidence interval and critical values, which you might have studied in inferential statistics subjects, that we can use Z and T test tables for hypothesis testing. So once again, we can say that the researcher's prime interest is to reject the null hypothesis so that the alternative hypothesis should be accepted and theory can be formulated. Examples for directional hypotheses, how to narrate them and how to label them in your research work. The null hypothesis can be, let us take another example, that women are more motivated than men. In the organizations, we are talking about the, it could be like reaching to the executive levels. Women are more motivated than men on the job. So how can we formulate such testable statement into null and alternative hypothesis? We can label it like this fashion, that H naught is equal to our colon the mean value of the motivation level of men is equal to the mean value of the motivation level of women. This is our null hypothesis, and we have already formulated that women are more motivated than men. We can also write down the same null hypothesis another way around, like in this fashion, H naught. If we subtract the mean motivation level, this mu represents the mean level of our sampled collected for this research, or will be collected for this research. The mean value of the motivation level of the men minus the mean value of the motivation level of the women will give us zero impact. Like there is no difference between the men and women's motivation level. What could be the alternative hypothesis, as we have studied that women are more motivated than men? So therefore, we can hypothesize the prime interest of our research, which is alternative hypothesis, that mean value of the motivation level of men is less than the mean value of the motivation level of women. Similarly, we can also hypothesize the alternative hypothesis in this fashion, like H1 or HA colon, mean value of the motivation level of women is greater than the mean value of the men motivation level. So we can say a directional hypothesis is telling us the direction level, like women are more motivated than men. As an example, there is a difference between the work ethics of the American and Arabian employees, as we have previously hypothesized. How can we just narrate them or label them in null and alternative hypothesis? The researcher can formulate the null hypothesis like H naught is equal to the mean value of the Americans for work ethics is equal to the mean value of the Asian employees or Arabian employees. Similarly, we can also narrate the null hypothesis in this fashion, like mean value. If we subtract the mean value of the American and the Arabian employees, the resultant value may be zero. Like it has no difference between the work ethic of American and Arabian employees. How can we formulate the alternative hypothesis? In the above example, like H1 or HA is equal to that there is some sort of difference between the mean value of the work ethics of American and Arabian employees. So now this is a non-directional hypothesis, since we are not clear about either the relationship is greater than or less than, or it is positive or negative in direction. So we can formulate the non-directional hypothesis in this fashion. Let us take another example. The greater the stress experience in the job, the lower the job satisfaction of the employee. Now this is once again, we can hypothesize that the null hypothesis could be like this fashion: H naught is equal to our colon. There is no relationship between stress experience on the job and the job satisfaction of the employee. Like this would be statistically expressed in this fashion: H naught or H in subscript This P represents the correlation or relationship between the stress experienced in the job and the job satisfaction of the employees. And we have hypothesized, or the researcher might have hypothesized, that the relationship P, or it can be represented with a symbol of rho, which you can find out over the internet, that what rho represents. It is it actually it has been used, and it represents the correlation between the dependent and independent variable. And we have hypothesized, our researcher might have had hypothesized, that there is zero correlation between the stress experienced in the job and the job satisfaction of the employee, where P represents the correlation between the stress and job satisfaction, which in this case is equal to 0. Therefore, the prime interest of the researcher is to reject the null hypothesis so that this statement may come true or accepted. In this case, what could be the alternative hypothesis, which is a testable statement, and the researcher is interested to go with the alternative? The alternative hypothesis for the above null can be stated as H1 or HA colon. This correlation symbol P is less than 0. When its value is less than 0, which is representing the correlation, and the correlation value normally moves between -1 to 0 and then up to +1. When there is the correlation value is +1, it will represent one-on-one positive relationship between dependent and independent variable. Like 1 unit increase will lead towards 1 unit increase in your 1 unit increase in the independent variable will leads to increase in 1 unit of dependent variable. Similarly, when the correlation value is -1, it means that a decrease in the 1 unit decrease in the independent variable will leads 1 unit decrease in the dependent variable. And finally, if the correlation is 0, then we will definitely go with the inability to reject the null hypothesis, which is explaining that there is no correlation between the stress experienced in the job by the employees and the job satisfaction. This is the reason we have hypothesized the alternative hypothesis in this fashion, because the statement was on the basis of theoretical framework and literature review. The material was supporting the hypothesis in a negative fashion, that greater the stress experience on the job, then ultimately it can reduce the job satisfaction level of the employee. So therefore, we have hypothesized our alternative hypothesis by expressing that the value of correlation may be less than 0, and it will represent a negative correlation. Let us discuss some more examples. Like there is a relationship between age and job satisfaction. Now this is the example of a non-directional hypothesis, a non-directional relationship. Since we cannot infer on the basis of this statement that either the job increase in the age factor of the employee will leads towards the increase in the job satisfaction, or it will reduce the job satisfaction of the employee. And similarly, if there is a decrease in the age factor of the employee, either it will increase the job satisfaction or it will decrease the job satisfaction of the employee. So from studying this statement, or after studying this statement, we cannot infer the direction of the relationship between dependent and independent variable. For this non-directional statement, the null hypothesis would be statistically expressed as H0 colon P, which was representing the correlation or relationship between dependent and independent variable, is equal to 0. When the correlation coefficient, which is normally represented by R in the statistical books, is 0, when the correlation coefficient hypothesized as 0, we are actually making a null hypothesis, or the researcher has formulated the null hypothesis in the fashion that there is no relationship between age and job satisfaction. What could be the alternative hypothesis, which is H1? Definitely, this is the prime interested hypothesis, which the researcher would like to prove it that there is a relationship between age and job satisfaction. So the alternative hypothesis says that the correlation coefficient between these two variables, let me remove these, correlation coefficient between the age and the job satisfaction of the employee is not 0. When it is not 0, so ultimately it will be somewhere around -1 to +1. So the correlation, when the correlation coefficient value is between -1 and +1, then we can infer and reject our null hypothesis, which was saying that there is no relationship between age and job satisfaction, and we'll go with the alternative hypothesis, and we will accept it that there is a relationship between age and job satisfaction. Now, either the relationship between these two factors is positive or negative. It will all depend upon your final statistical results, which can be formulated after the collection of data with the help of primary and secondary techniques, and as well as after designing your research model in next step, and then later on applying the statistical tools to find out either this statement, which was hypothesized as null statement, is accepted or it is going to be rejected. When this is rejected by the researcher will go with the alternative hypothesis, and hence he or she can infer and finally conclude or deduce that there is certain relationship between age and job satisfaction, depending upon your final statistical results. If those results are favoring for positive relationship or negative relationship. So this was all about hypothesis formulation and development, which could be directional, non-directional, if and then statement wise. And these hypotheses are actually formulated from the theoretical framework what we have designed in the previous step. I hope you understand how to formulate the research hypothesis, which is a testable statement. But still, if you have any confusion or question, you are free to ask on my registered email. Good luck for the day. Allah Hafiz.